There is an engine that once owned American highways, an engine so dominant that competitors spent years trying to figure out how to catch up. The Detroit 8V92 didn't whisper down the interstate, it screamed. And for nearly 2 decades, that scream meant one thing to everyone who heard it: power had arrived. But if this engine was so unstoppable, so beloved by the men who drove it, why did it vanish from the roads almost overnight? The answer has nothing to do with mechanical failure. It has everything to do with a world that changed faster than any engine could adapt. But to understand how the 8V92 rose so high, we need to start somewhere unexpected. We need to start at sea. What does the United States Navy have to do with highway trucking? More than you might expect. Detroit Diesel had been experimenting with two-stroke diesel technology since the 1930s. But their engines spent most of those early years doing work that had nothing to do with trucks. They powered boats, they ran generators, they sat in warehouses humming along as stationary power plants. These were not glamorous applications, but they taught Detroit's engineers something invaluable. They learned how to build engines that could run continuously under punishing loads without falling apart. When the Second World War arrived, that knowledge became a strategic asset. The Navy needed reliable power for patrol boats, landing craft, and support vessels. Detroit Diesel delivered. Their engines proved they could handle salt air, tropical heat, freezing temperatures, and the kind of sustained operation that would reduce other power plants to scrap metal. By the time the war ended, Detroit had something their competitors lacked: decades of experience building engines designed for brutal, continuous duty. And they were about to put that experience to work on American highways. The Series 92 family emerged in the 1960s as Detroit's next evolution in two-stroke diesel technology. These engines had already proven themselves in marine applications, powering commercial vessels and military craft with the kind of reliability that made captains sleep easier at night. But Detroit's engineers believed they could push the concept further. They believed they could build something truly extraordinary for the trucking industry. The breakthrough came when they decided to expand the cylinder count. The inline 6 and the V6 configurations had performed well in buses and lighter applications. But what would happen if they added 2 more cylinders? What kind of power could they unlock? The 8V92 that rolled out in the early 1970s was not a subtle machine. At 736 cubic inches of displacement, it ranked among the largest engines ever installed in a highway truck. Divide that displacement across 8 cylinders, and each one was producing somewhere around 53 horsepower on its own. Combined, they delivered over 425 horsepower and more than 1,400 pound-feet of torque. These were numbers that made competing manufacturers nervous, but the displacement alone does not explain why the 8V92 felt so different from anything else on the road. The secret was the 2-stroke operating cycle. In a conventional 4-stroke diesel, each cylinder fires once every 2 revolutions of the crankshaft. The engine goes through intake, compression, combustion, and exhaust in sequence. This means that at any given moment, only a portion of the cylinders are actually producing power. The 2-stroke design works differently. Every cylinder fires on every revolution. There is no separate intake and exhaust stroke. Instead, the engine uses a massive supercharger called a roots blower to force fresh air into the cylinders while simultaneously pushing exhaust gases out. The result is twice as many power strokes for the same number of cylinders. Where a 4-stroke V8 fires 4 times per revolution, a 2-stroke V8 fires 8 times. That mechanical reality translated into something drivers could feel the moment they touched the throttle. The 8V92 produced torque, with an urgency that four-stroke engines could not match. It pulled loaded trailers up grades that made other engines labor. It maintained highway speeds where competitors had to downshift. And it did all of this while making a sound that became legendary. The Roots blower gave the Detroit two-stroke its distinctive voice. That high-pitched whine layered over the deep rumble of the exhaust created an acoustic signature that truckers could identify from a quarter-mile away. When you heard that sound approaching, you knew exactly what was coming. Timing is everything in business, and the 8V92 arrived at precisely the right moment in American trucking history. The late 1970s brought deregulation to the industry. The Motor Carrier Act of 1980 removed decades of government control over routes, rates, and market entry. Suddenly, anyone with a truck and enough determination could enter the freight business. Independent owner-operators flooded into the market, and these entrepreneurs needed equipment that could work as hard as they did. The 8V92 fit their needs perfectly. Here was an engine that could handle maximum legal loads on any route in the country. It could climb mountain passes without losing momentum. It could run coast to coast without breaking down. And it could be maintained by mechanics who understood the elegant simplicity of mechanical fuel injection and straightforward engineering. Fleet operators appreciated different qualities. The engine's modular construction meant that repairs could happen quickly. The cylinder liners were designed as wet sleeves that mechanics could pull and replace without dismantling the entire power plant. A skilled technician could swap a liner roadside if necessary, getting a disabled truck back into service within hours rather than days. In an industry where every idle hour represented lost revenue, this serviceability translated directly into profit. Detroit Diesel's dominance peaked in the early 1980s, when nearly 4 out of every 10 heavy-duty truck engines sold in America carried their badge. The 8V92 had become their flagship product, the engine that fleet managers requested by name and owner-operators aspired to own. The engine earned cover stories in industry magazines and built a devoted following that stretched from coast to coast, but every triumph carries within it the seeds of future struggle. The very characteristics that made the 8V92 dominant were about to become liabilities, and the first warnings appeared not from competitors, but from a much simpler source: the fuel pump. How much fuel does raw power consume? The 8V92 provided an uncomfortable answer. The two-stroke design that gave the engine its remarkable power density came with an unavoidable trade-off. Firing on every revolution meant burning fuel on every revolution. The mechanical supercharger that enabled the scavenging process consumed energy simply to operate. And the engine's conservative tuning, necessary to ensure the legendary reliability that owners demanded, meant efficiency was not optimized. Under similar highway conditions, a well-driven four-stroke engine might achieve 6 or 7 miles per gallon. The 8V92 rarely exceeded 5. On challenging routes with heavy loads, some operators reported numbers closer to 4. When diesel fuel cost less than $1 per gallon, this difference seemed manageable. The engine's power and reliability justified the extra expense. But fuel prices do not stay low forever. The oil shocks of the 1970s had already demonstrated how quickly energy costs could spike. And through the 1980s, a slow but steady increase in fuel prices began to change the economic calculations that fleet managers performed every quarter. The math was brutal. Consider a truck running 100,000 miles per year. At 5 miles per gallon, that truck consumes 20,000 gallons of diesel annually. At 7 miles per gallon, consumption drops to roughly 14,300 gallons. The difference, nearly 6,000 gallons, represents thousands of dollars in operating costs. Multiply that across a fleet of 100 trucks, and fuel efficiency transforms from a nice-to-have feature into a competitive necessity. Owner-operators felt the squeeze in different ways. Their profit margins depended on controlling costs, and fuel represented the single largest variable expense in their operations. An engine that consumed 20% more diesel than its competitors ate directly into the money these entrepreneurs took home. The 8V92's power still mattered, but it mattered less when the fuel bill arrived. Detroit Diesel understood the problem. They experimented with various modifications intended to improve economy without sacrificing the characteristics that customers valued. Electronic controls were added to manage fuel delivery more precisely. Turbocharger configurations were adjusted to optimize boost pressure. Injection timing was refined. But these improvements could not overcome the fundamental physics of the two-stroke design. The architecture that delivered unmatched power also demanded unmatched fuel consumption. If fuel economy was a slow-building headache, emissions regulations were a gathering hurricane. The Environmental Protection Agency had spent the 1970s focused primarily on passenger vehicles. Catalytic converters and unleaded gasoline transformed the automotive fleet, but heavy trucks remained relatively unregulated. This was about to change. The 8V92's two-stroke operating cycle created emissions challenges that went beyond simple fuel consumption. The scavenging process, where fresh air pushes exhaust gases out of the cylinder, was not perfectly efficient. Some portion of the incoming fuel charge escaped with the exhaust before combustion could occur. This short-circuiting contributed to hydrocarbon emissions that four-stroke engines avoided through their more complete separation of intake and exhaust events. The oil consumption characteristics of two-stroke operation added another layer of difficulty. These engines burned more lubricant than their four-stroke counterparts, contributing particulate matter and additional emissions to the exhaust stream. What had been acceptable when regulations barely existed became increasingly problematic as standards tightened. Federal emissions requirements for heavy-duty trucks arrived in 1988. These initial standards were relatively modest, but they signaled a clear direction. The EPA intended to regulate truck engines with increasing stringency. Future standards would demand progressively cleaner exhaust. The engines that could not adapt would eventually be pushed out of the market. Detroit Diesel faced a fundamental challenge. The two-stroke design that defined their identity and powered their success was inherently more difficult to clean up than four-stroke alternatives. The scavenging process, the oil consumption patterns, and the rapid firing rate all complicated emissions control. Meeting future standards would require either revolutionary breakthrough technologies or a fundamental reconsideration of the company's engineering approach. Meanwhile, competitors were preparing for this new reality. Cummins and Caterpillar had been developing four-stroke engines for years. These power plants, while once dismissed as insufficiently powerful for serious trucking applications, were improving rapidly. Electronic controls were enabling power outputs that approached two-stroke territory while delivering significantly lower emissions and better fuel economy. The trucking industry itself was changing its priorities. Environmental consciousness was growing among shippers and the public. Companies began considering their carbon footprint and emissions profile as part of their corporate image. The 8V92, once celebrated for its raw capability, was becoming a symbol of an older, dirtier era that the industry wanted to leave behind. By the early 1990s, Detroit Diesel faced a decision that would define the company's future. The 8V92 remained their best-selling engine. Owner-operators still coveted it. The sound still echoed through truck stops, but the writing on the wall was becoming impossible to ignore. The 1994 emission standards would require fundamental changes to any engine that hoped to remain in production, and the standards scheduled for subsequent years would be even more demanding. Detroit's engineers had pushed the two-stroke architecture as far as it could reasonably go, Electronic controls had improved fuel efficiency modestly. Various emissions countermeasures had helped meet the earlier, less stringent requirements. But meeting the 1994 standards would require extensive modifications. Sophisticated after-treatment systems would need to be added. Combustion processes would need to be fundamentally altered. And even with these changes, the power advantage that made the 8V92 attractive would likely be compromised. The company faced a choice between two paths. They could invest massively in attempting to make two-stroke technology compliant with the coming regulations. This would require years of development, hundreds of millions of dollars in engineering, and might ultimately prove impossible. Or they could pivot toward four-stroke technology, where the path to emissions compliance was clearer, even though it meant abandoning the engines that had made Detroit diesel famous. In 1993, Detroit Diesel made its decision. The two-stroke era was ending. The 8V92 would be discontinued, along with the entire line of two-stroke truck engines. The manufacturer that had built its identity on the distinctive sound and irresistible power of the Detroit two-stroke was walking away from the technology entirely. The reaction from the trucking community ranged from disappointment to outrage. Longtime customers felt abandoned. Owner-operators who had structured their operations around the capabilities of the 8V92 suddenly faced an uncertain future. Many placed orders for new two-stroke powered trucks before the production lines went cold, hoping to squeeze a few more years out of their preferred engines. Detroit Diesel committed to developing new four-stroke engines that could meet future emission standards while still delivering the power and reliability that customers expected. The transition would not be easy. The company's initial four-stroke offering suffered from problems that made loyal customers nostalgic for the engines being replaced. Detroit's share of the market declined as buyers moved to competitors who had been building four-stroke technology for years. Production ended in 1995. The final 8V92 built for highway use marked the close of an era that had lasted more than 2 decades. The engine was gone, but its influence remained. From a purely technical standpoint, the 8V92 represented the outer limits of what two-stroke diesel technology could achieve in highway applications. No engine of its generation matched the power it delivered. The modular construction philosophy it pioneered shaped how manufacturers approached serviceability for years afterward. The lessons learned from its development and deployment informed the design of subsequent power plants, even those built on four-stroke principles. But the 8V92 left a deeper mark on trucking culture. It created a generation of drivers who associated Detroit Diesel with capability and reliability. The distinctive sound became embedded in the acoustic landscape of American highways. Truckers who drove these engines developed a loyalty that persisted long after the last one was built. Today, nearly 3 decades after production ended, the 8V92 maintains a devoted following. Collectors seek out trucks equipped with these engines. Enthusiasts attend shows specifically to hear the Roots blower whine and feel the torque that once moved the nation's freight. In marine and stationary applications where emissions regulations are less stringent, rebuilt 8V92 engines continue to operate, providing the same reliable power they delivered decades ago. The engine's story also contains lessons about the nature of industrial success. The 8V92 was optimized for a specific set of conditions: cheap fuel, minimal regulation, and customers who valued raw power above all else. When those conditions changed, the engine's greatest strengths became vulnerabilities. Its power came at the cost of fuel efficiency. Its simplicity made it difficult to adapt to electronic controls. Its two-stroke architecture resisted the emissions technologies that would define future engines. The 8V92 was not banned. It simply became obsolete as the world around it transformed. The engine that seemed unstoppable was stopped not by mechanical failure or competitive defeat, but by the shifting priorities of an industry and a society that moved in directions the engine could not follow. There is something poignant about that reality. The 8V92 did exactly what it was designed to do. It delivered unprecedented power with remarkable reliability. It served its operators faithfully for millions of miles. And when the time came, when the calculations no longer worked and the regulations could not be met, it stepped aside with the dignity of a machine that had given everything it had. In some truck stops late at night, you can still occasionally hear that distinctive sound. An old timer rolling through with an 8V92 under the hood, keeping the memory alive a few more miles. The whine of the roots blower, the rumble of the exhaust, the unmistakable voice of an engine that once dominated everything it touched. So here is a question worth considering. In today's rush toward hybrid powertrains, electric trucks, and artificial intelligence, what are we building that might seem as outdated 30 years from now as the 8V92 seems today? Are we optimizing for conditions that will not last, or are we building for the world that is actually coming? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story interesting, subscribe for more deep dives into the engines, innovations, and industrial history that shaped the world we live in.